The rain in New York City was coming down hard that Tuesday evening, turning the city streets into glossy mirrors reflecting the bright neon lights. It was the kind of weather that made everyone rush home, heads ducked low, umbrellas fighting against the wind. But for the people inside the small, worn-down diner on the corner of 4th Street, the rush was just beginning. The place was packed with the smell of fried onions, stale coffee, and wet wool. It was loud, chaotic, and the air inside felt thick with the noise of clattering cutlery and shouting voices from the open kitchen. In the middle of all this chaos stood a waitress who had seen it all. She was a woman in her late 50s, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her feet throbbing inside her worn-out sneakers. She had been working at this diner for decades, long enough to know that Tuesday nights were unpredictable. She moved between the tables with a heavy pot of coffee in one hand, forcing a tired smile for customers who barely looked up from their phones. She was exhausted, her shift dragging on, but she kept moving because the tips were decent and the rent was due. Suddenly, the little bell above the front door jingled. A gust of cold, wet air swept into the room, making a few customers shiver and pull their coats tighter. The waitress didn't look up immediately, she was busy clearing a table of half-eaten pancakes. But when she finally turned around to see who had walked in, she paused for a moment. It wasn't because the person was loud or demanding. It was because of how quiet he was. The man who stepped inside was trying very hard not to be noticed. He was wearing a dark leather jacket that looked like it had seen better days, and a blue baseball cap was pulled down low over his eyes. He had a thick, bushy beard that covered most of his face, and his shoulders were hunched forward as if he was trying to make himself smaller. He didn't walk with the confident stride of a celebrity or the hurried pace of a businessman. He walked slowly, carefully shaking the rain off his coat near the door, being mindful not to splash anyone nearby. To the rest of the crowded diner, he was just another guy seeking shelter from the storm. They glanced at him for a second and then went back to their burgers and conversations. No one realized that this unassuming man, dressed in simple clothes and hiding under a hat, was actually Keanu Reeves. One of the most famous action stars in the world was standing right there, and nobody had a clue. Keanu stood near the entrance for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't looking for fans, and he certainly wasn't looking for attention. He was looking for a corner. A place where he could disappear. The diner was loud, filled with the noise of a city that never sleeps, but he seemed to be carrying a heavy, silent burden of his own. He spotted a small booth in the very back of the restaurant, tucked away in a shadowy corner near the kitchen swing doors. It was the least desirable seat in the house, likely to be bumped by servers every few minutes, but to him, it looked perfect. He made his way through the narrow aisle, squeezing past a row of hungry customers. As he walked, he didn't demand space. He politely murmured "excuse me" and "sorry" to everyone he passed, his voice soft and raspy. He moved with a gentle grace, not wanting to disturb anyone's dinner. When he finally reached the booth, he slid into the seat, letting out a long, deep breath. It was the kind of breath that someone holds in all day until they finally feel safe enough to let it out. The waitress watched him from behind the counter. She couldn't see his eyes under the hat, but she could see the way he sat. He looked incredibly lonely. He slumped slightly, resting his elbows on the table, and stared out the window beside him at the rainy street. He didn't take out his phone to scroll or check emails. He just sat there, watching the water droplets race down the glass. For a man who was probably used to red carpets and flashing cameras, he looked incredibly small in that moment. She grabbed a menu and a glass of water, deciding to go take his order before the dinner rush got even crazier. As she walked over, she noticed that despite his ragged appearance and the beard that hid his face, there was something familiar about him. Maybe it was the shape of his nose, or the way his dark hair curled slightly at the edges of the cap. But she brushed the thought aside. Why would one of the richest actors on the planet be sitting in a beat-up diner like hers, all alone, looking like a lost puppy? She stopped at the edge of his booth. He didn't notice her at first, he seemed lost in his own thoughts. She waited a second, not wanting to startle him, before gently placing the water glass on the table. The sound of the ice clinking brought him back to the room. He looked up quickly, and for a split second, his eyes met hers. "Hi there," the waitress said, her voice friendly but professional. "How are you doing tonight?" Keanu looked at her, and a small, polite smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a fake Hollywood smile. It was a genuine, slightly tired smile that reached his eyes. "I'm doing okay," he said softly. "Thanks for asking. Just trying to get out of the rain." "Yeah, it's pretty nasty out there tonight," she replied, handing him the menu. "Take your time. Let me know if you need anything." He nodded, thanking her again with such sincerity that it caught her off guard. "I appreciate it," he said. She walked away, shaking her head slightly. Most customers were grumpy about the weather, or they barked orders at her without even looking up. But this man, he looked her in the eye. He spoke kindly. He seemed humble. She went back behind the counter to punch in an order for another table, but she found herself glancing back at the corner booth. There he sat, the famous action star, completely alone. He was hidden in plain sight, surrounded by people who loved his movies but had no idea who he was. He opened the menu, studying it intently as if he were reading a complex script, but he was just looking for a simple meal. For a few moments, the world was too loud for him, and this little booth was his only shelter. He wasn't the chosen one or the hero of an action movie right now, he was just a tired man wanting a quiet dinner, unaware that his night was about to take a turn he never expected. The waitress stood by the counter for a moment, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes drifting back to the man in the corner booth. The dinner rush was picking up speed, and the noise level in the small diner was rising like a wave. Glasses were clinking, plates were crashing, and the sound of sizzling meat from the grill filled the air. But despite all the chaos, the corner booth felt like a bubble of silence. The man with the beard and the baseball cap sat still, looking down at his laminated menu with total focus. He wasn't tapping his fingers impatiently or looking around for a server to yell at. He was just waiting. She grabbed her order pad and took a deep breath, putting on her customer service face before heading over. When she reached the table, he looked up immediately. His eyes were dark and gentle, hidden slightly under the brim of the cap. He didn't have that annoyed look people usually get when they are hungry and have been waiting. "Ready to order?" she asked, clicking her pen. He nodded once. "Yes, thank you," he said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but very polite. "Could I please just have a cheeseburger medium well? And some fries?" "Sure thing," she said, waiting to see if he wanted anything else. "Anything to drink with that?" "Just a coffee, please." "Black," he replied. "And maybe some water." She scribbled it down quickly. "You got it? I'll get that coffee right out for you." "Thank you," he said again, looking her right in the eyes. "I appreciate it." It was such a small interaction, but it struck her. In a city where people were often rushing, rude, or treating service workers like invisible robots, this man was different. There was a humility about him that was rare. He wasn't demanding. He wasn't complaining about the wait. He said please and thank you like he really meant it. She walked away feeling a little lighter, surprised by how a simple good manner could change her mood. Back at the service station, she poured a fresh cup of coffee. The cook, a big guy with a grumpy face, yelled out an order for table 6. She ignored the noise and focused on the coffee. She thought about the man in the corner. There was something oddly familiar about the way he held his shoulders, or the shape of his face under that thick beard. It was niggling at the back of her mind, like a song you can't remember the name of. But with 10 other tables to worry about, she didn't have time to play detective. She carried the coffee and a glass of ice water back to his table. As she set them down, she noticed he had taken off his jacket. He was wearing a simple, gray t-shirt underneath. He looked even more tired without the jacket, his frame looking thinner than she expected. He looked like someone who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, yet he smiled when she put the cup down. "Here you go," she said. "Cream and sugar are right there if you change your mind." "This is perfect, thank you," he said, wrapping his hands around the warm mug. She lingered for just a second. It was a slow night for gossip, and he seemed like a safe person to talk to. "Long day?" she asked, nodding at his tired expression. He took a sip of the coffee before answering. "Yeah, it's been a bit of a long one. You know how it goes. Just trying to keep moving." "I hear that," she laughed softly. "I've been on my feet for 6 hours already. Only 4 more to go." He looked at her with genuine sympathy. "That's tough work. You're doing a great job, though. Seriously. You're running this place like a pro." The waitress blinked in surprise. It was such a strange thing to hear from a random customer in a dive diner. Usually, the only feedback she got was complaints about cold fries or weak coffee. To hear a stranger compliment her work ethic felt surprisingly good. It made her stand up a little straighter. "Well, thank you," she said, smiling a real smile this time. "That's nice of you to say." "It's the truth," he said simply. He took another sip and looked out the rainy window, ending the conversation politely but gently. She walked away to check on her other tables, her mind racing. Who was this guy? He was way too polite to be just a regular New Yorker passing through. As she refilled sodas for a loud group of teenagers, she found herself glancing back at him every few minutes. He sat there, sipping his black coffee, watching the rain. He didn't pull out a cell phone. He didn't have headphones on. He was just sitting there, alone with his thoughts. He looked peaceful, but also incredibly lonely. It was a strange contrast. He seemed like a man who was used to being surrounded by people but was currently choosing to be by himself. Suddenly, a group of guys walked into the diner. They were loud, laughing and shoving each other, clearly coming from a bar or a party. They were the kind of customers every server dreads: loud, messy, and probably demanding. They sat at a large booth near the back, close to Keanu's table. The waitress winced. She hoped they wouldn't bother the quiet man. He seemed to value his privacy so much. She watched as one of the guys, a tall man in a hoodie, looked over at the corner booth. He stared for a long time, squinting his eyes. He nudged his friend and pointed. The quiet man in the corner didn't notice. He was too busy looking at a wet napkin he was folding on the table. The waitress felt a sudden knot of worry in her stomach. She knew that look. It was the look of recognition. She hurried over to the loud group to take their drink order, trying to distract them, but she could hear them whispering. "Is that him?" one of them whispered loudly. "It looks like him." "No way," another one laughed. "Why would he be here? He looks like a hobo." "Seriously though, look at the nose. And the hair under the cap. That's John Wick." The waitress froze for a split second. John Wick. The name clicked in her brain. She looked back at the man in the corner, really looking at him this time. The shape of the nose, the intense sad eyes, the way his hair curled, oh my God. It was Keanu Reeves? The famous movie star. The guy who played Neo. The guy who was currently one of the biggest action heroes in the world. He was sitting in her diner, in a ratty t-shirt, eating a burger and complimenting her coffee pouring skills. She felt a wave of shock, followed immediately by a protective instinct. She looked at him again. He was just sitting there, minding his own business, trying to have a normal night. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was just trying to be Keanu. If the table next to him realized for sure, they were going to swarm him. They were going to take selfies, ask for autographs, and ruin his dinner. And maybe, just maybe, ruin the only quiet moment he had had in a long time. She decided right then that she wasn't going to let that happen. She walked over to his table to check on him, stepping in between his booth and the noisy group, creating a physical barrier. "How's the coffee?" she asked, perhaps a little louder than necessary. Keanu looked up, his expression calm. "It's great. Thanks." "Good," she said, leaning against the table slightly, her back turned to the staring group. "Food will be out in a minute. Just wanted to make sure you were okay." "I'm good," he said, offering that humble smile again. "Thank you." She nodded and walked back to the kitchen, but her ears were open. She could hear the guys at the next table getting louder, their confidence growing. They were already pulling out their phones, turning on their flashlights to take pictures of the menu, but the lenses were drifting toward the corner. The peaceful atmosphere was starting to crack. The bubble of silence was about to burst. The waitress grabbed the plate with his burger from the pass. It was a simple meal, but suddenly it felt like the most important thing in the world to get it to him before the storm hit. She didn't know if she could stop them, but she was going to try her hardest to make sure he could finish his meal in peace. He had been kind to her when he didn't have to be, and she was going to return the favor. The waitress placed the plate down on the table in front of him. It was a simple cheeseburger with a pile of golden fries, steam rising off the warm food. For a second, Keanu's face lit up. It wasn't a big, dramatic expression, but a small, genuine look of happiness. He looked like a kid who had just been served his favorite meal after a long day. He reached for the ketchup, ready to take that first satisfying bite. But before the bottle could even make a sound, the moment was shattered. "Hey. Excuse me." The voice was loud and came from the table of guys who had been whispering earlier. They weren't whispering anymore. One of them, a tall guy wearing a backwards baseball cap, was standing up, pointing a finger directly at Keanu's booth. The entire diner went quiet for a split second. The hum of conversation stopped, and the clinking of forks seemed to pause. Everyone turned to look. "You're him, aren't you?" the tall guy shouted, walking closer to the booth. "You're that guy? The action star?" Keanu froze. His hand was halfway to the ketchup. He didn't look annoyed, and he didn't look angry. He just looked tired. He let out a very small sigh, almost invisible, and put his hands down on the table. He looked up at the man approaching him. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to lie and say he was just a look-alike. He knew that wouldn't work. He just gave a small, polite nod. "Yeah, it's me," Keanu said softly. "Hi." As soon as he said it, the dam broke. The tall guy whipped his phone out of his pocket and turned on the camera flash. The bright light blinded Keanu for a second, making him squint. "Oh my God. Guys, it is him." The guy yelled back to his friends. "Get over here." Suddenly, the quiet, lonely dinner Keanu had planned was over. The rest of the group stood up and rushed toward the booth. It wasn't just them, either. Other people in the diner realized what was happening. A couple from a few tables away stood up to get a better look. Two guys near the window pulled out their phones, hoping to record a video for social media. The energy in the room changed completely. It went from a tired, rainy evening to an exciting event. Keanu was now trapped in a circle of strangers. He was stuck in the corner booth with nowhere to go. He put his napkin down on his uneaten burger. He didn't reach for his food. He knew he wasn't going to be eating anytime soon. The waitress watched from behind the counter, her heart sinking. She saw the way he sat there. He didn't call for security or yell at them to back off. He just sat there, ready to face the music because he felt like he owed it to them. "Can we get a selfie, man? Just one," the tall guy asked, already leaning over the table and shoving his phone into Keanu's face. "Sure," Keanu said. He didn't really sound excited, but he was trying to be nice. "Okay." He leaned in. The flash went off again. Then another guy pushed his way in. "Me too, bro. I love your movies. I've seen them all." "Thank you," Keanu said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned in again. Flash. More people were gathering now. It was getting tight around the booth. A woman with a bright pink purse squeezed past the tall guys. "Oh my goodness, Keanu. Can I get a picture? I'm such a huge fan." "Of course," he said. He shifted in his seat to make room for her, even though his personal space was being completely invaded. He was being a gentleman. He was being the person everyone expected him to be. But the waitress could see the truth. She saw the way his shoulders were tense up to his ears. She saw him looking at the door, wishing he could just slip away. He looked at his cold burger with a sense of sadness. It was such a small thing, a burger and fries, but it represented his freedom. And now, even that was taken away by his fame. The crowd was getting louder. People were shouting over each other. "Do the voice." One person yelled. "Say I know Kung Fu." Another one laughed. They weren't being mean, but they weren't treating him like a human being. They were treating him like a character in a movie, something to be played with. Keanu laughed nervously, rubbing the back of his neck. Maybe not right now guys, I'm just trying to have dinner," he said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "Come on, just one line." Someone insisted, holding a phone inches from his nose. He looked down at the table. He felt trapped. He didn't want to be rude. He knew these were the people who paid to see his movies, and he was grateful for them. He really was. But he was also just a man who wanted to eat his food in peace. The contradiction was written all over his face. He was overwhelmed. The flash from the phones kept going off like strobe lights. Click, click, click. The bright lights were hurting his eyes. He blinked hard, trying to adjust to the darkness in between flashes. He took a sip of his water, just to have something to do with his hands. His hand was shaking slightly. "This is crazy," someone in the back of the crowd whispered. "It's really John Wick." The waitress clenched her jaw. She saw the tall guy reach out and slap Keanu on the back, a little too hard, like they were best friends. Keanu flinched slightly but didn't say anything. He just smiled that tight, polite smile. It was getting out of hand. The circle was closing in. They were blocking the aisle so other customers couldn't get by. The manager wasn't around, and the other staff were too busy staring or filming with their own phones to step in. They were all starstruck. Keanu looked around for an exit, but there were people on all sides. He looked at the waitress, and for a second, their eyes met again. He didn't say anything, but she could see the plea in his look. It was a look of helplessness. He was drowning in a sea of attention, and he didn't know how to swim to shore without looking like a jerk. He was sacrificing his own comfort just to make a bunch of strangers happy. The noise level was deafening now. People were shouting, laughing, and pushing. The smell of the food was gone, replaced by the smell of cologne, rain-soaked coats, and the metallic tang of smartphone batteries. The peaceful bubble was completely gone. Keanu's dinner sat on the table, the fries getting cold and soggy, the burger congealing under the heat lamp of the dining room. He hadn't taken a single bite. The tall guy was now demanding a video for his TikTok. "Do a shout out to my boys. Come on, man, live stream." Keanu shook his head slowly. "I really just want to eat," he said, his voice a little stronger this time, but still kind. "Don't be like that," the guy scoffed, acting offended. "We made you famous, dude." The comment hung in the air. It was rude and unnecessary. Keanu just looked down, biting his lip. He didn't want to argue. The tension in the room spiked. The waitress had seen enough. She grabbed a coffee pot, even though Keanu's cup was full, and marched toward the booth. Her sneakers squeaked against the floor, but the crowd was too loud to notice. She was about to burst this bubble herself. The waitress felt a sudden surge of anger rise in her chest, hot and sharp. It wasn't just because they were being loud, it was because they were being cruel. Seeing the famous action star shrink into his seat while that tall guy poked his finger at him made her blood boil. She had watched Keanu Reeves handle himself with incredible patience so far. He hadn't gotten angry, he hadn't called for security, and he hadn't tried to pull rank. He just sat there and took it. But enough was enough. This was her diner, her floor, and she wasn't going to let her customer be bullied, no matter who he was. She tightened her grip on the coffee pot she was holding and marched toward the booth. Her sneakers squeaked against the greasy floor, but the crowd was too busy shouting and flashing their phones to hear her coming. The tall guy with the backwards cap was still leaning over Keanu, demanding a video, his face flushed with excitement and alcohol. Other people were pressing in from the sides, holding their phones up like they were trying to capture a wild animal in a zoo. "All right, that is enough," the waitress shouted. Her voice was loud and cut through the noise like a knife. The circle of people didn't break immediately. A few of them turned their heads to see who was yelling, but most of them kept their cameras pointed at Keanu. The tall guy didn't even move. He just waved his hand at her dismissively, like she was a fly he was trying to swat away. "Give us a minute, lady," the guy said, not even looking at her. "We're almost done." "No, you are done right now," she said, stepping firmly into the space between the tall guy and the booth. She was a head shorter than him, but she squared her shoulders and looked him dead in the eye. She used the same voice she used to kick out rowdy drunks at 2 o'clock in the morning. Back up and give him some room." The guy finally turned to look at her, annoyed. "Chill out. It's Keanu Reeves. He's used to this. It's part of his job." The waitress shook her head, her face hard. "I don't care who he is. In my diner, his job is to be a customer and eat his dinner, and my job is to make sure he can do that without being harassed by a bunch of strangers." The crowd went quiet. The word harassed hung in the air. It made the situation sound different. It wasn't just fun and games anymore. People started lowering their phones. "Come on, we just want a picture," the guy argued, though his voice was less confident now. "Look at him," she said, pointing a finger at the booth. "Does he look like he wants to take a picture? He hasn't even touched his food. He's trapped. You are blocking the aisle and disturbing everyone else in here. If you want to stay, you go sit down and eat. If you want to bother him, you can leave." The tall guy looked past her at Keanu. The actor was sitting there, looking up at the waitress with an expression of total surprise. He wasn't used to someone stepping in for him like this. Usually, he had to be the one to say no, which always made him feel guilty. Seeing this tired waitress stand up to a crowd of people just to defend his peace was something he never expected. The guy looked around at the other diners, who were now watching him with judgmental eyes. He realized he looked like the bully. The fun had gone out of it. "Whatever," he muttered, putting his phone in his pocket. "Let's go, guys. Food here probably sucks anyway." He turned and walked back to his table, grabbing his jacket. His friends followed, looking a little sheepish. The rest of the crowd, sensing that the show was over, began to drift away too. The magic of the moment had faded, replaced by the awkward feeling that they had crossed a line. One by one, they put their phones away and went back to their own meals, pretending they hadn't just been swarming a movie star. Within a minute, the chaos was gone. The noise level in the diner dropped back down to a normal hum. The air felt lighter. The waitress let out a long breath and turned back to the booth. Keanu was looking up at her, his eyes wide. He looked a little shaken, but he was also smiling. It was a real smile this time, one of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. That was really amazing. I didn't know what to do." "You don't have to do anything," she said, her voice softening now that the crowd was gone. She reached out and poured a little more coffee into his cup, even though it didn't need it. It was just an excuse to stay there for a second longer. People forget that famous people are still people. They think just because they see you in movies, they own a piece of you. It makes me sick." Keanu nodded, looking down at his hands. "It's okay. I know they mean well, mostly. It just gets loud sometimes." "Well, you eat in peace now," she said firmly. "If anyone else comes over, you point them at me. I'll handle them." He looked up at her again, and for a second, he didn't look like a movie star at all. He just looked like a regular guy who was incredibly thankful for a small act of kindness. "You're very kind," he said, seriously. "Thank you for seeing me." "I see you," she said simply. "Enjoy your burger. I'll make sure the kitchen heats it up for you since it got cold." She walked away, feeling a little tremble in her hands. She couldn't believe she had just yelled at a table of customers. Her heart was still pounding in her chest. But when she glanced back over her shoulder, she saw Keanu pick up his burger and take a bite. He closed his eyes for a second, enjoying the food. He was safe. He was alone again, in the best way possible. And she was the one who made it happen. The diner finally settled back into its usual rhythm. The noise from the kitchen, the clinking of silverware, and the low hum of conversations returned, washing away the strange tension that had filled the room just minutes before. The waitress moved between her tables, refilling sodas and dropping off checks, but her mind kept drifting back to the corner booth. Keanu was finally eating. He was taking his time with the burger, chewing slowly and savoring each bite. The chaos of the crowd had faded, replaced by a quiet bubble of peace around him. He looked much more relaxed now. His shoulders, which had been hunched up to his ears in defense, had finally dropped. He wasn't looking around nervously anymore. He was just a man enjoying a meal. Watching him eat with such simple pleasure made the waitress smile to herself. It made her feel good to know that she had played a small part in giving him that moment. It wasn't about saving a celebrity, it was about protecting a person who just wanted to be left alone. After about 20 minutes, Keanu wiped his mouth with a napkin and pushed the empty plate away. He took a long sip of his coffee, draining the cup, and then leaned back against the soft red vinyl of the booth. He let out a contented sigh, glancing out the window at the rain, which was still falling hard against the glass. He looked rested. The weariness from earlier was still there, etched into the lines of his face, but the sharp edge of stress was gone. He caught her eye from across the room and gave a small, polite nod. It was the universal signal for check, please. The waitress walked over to the register and punched in his table number. She looked at the total on the screen. It wasn't much, just the price of a burger, fries, and a coffee. A few dollars and cents. She stood there for a moment, thinking about everything that had happened. She thought about how kind he had been when he first walked in, how polite he was when she spilled a little water filling his glass, and how gracious he was when a mob of strangers cornered him. He hadn't complained once. He hadn't asked for special treatment. He had just accepted the chaos with a sad smile. She made a quick decision. She reached into her own apron pocket and pulled out a few crumpled dollar bills of her own, enough to cover the bill and a little extra for the cook. She placed the money in the register before the manager could see. Then, she tore the receipt from the machine. Instead of just leaving the bill face down, she took a pen and turned it over. On the back, she wrote a short message in her neat, hurried handwriting. It wasn't a request for an autograph, and it wasn't a flirty compliment. It was just a human promise. She walked back to the booth, the paper in her hand. Keanu saw her coming and sat up straight, reaching for his wallet. He was already pulling out a $20 bill, ready to pay and leave. "Here you go," she said, placing the receipt on the table in front of him. "Thank you," he mumbled, reaching for the paper. He turned it over, expecting to see the list of items and the total price. Instead, he saw her handwriting. His eyes scanned the words. The bill had been crossed out. In its place, she had written, "Your secret is safe with me. Thanks for being kind. Dinner is on me." Keanu froze. He stared at the paper for a long time, reading the words again. He blinked, clearly surprised. A look of genuine emotion washed over his face. He looked up at her, his eyebrows raised in disbelief. You paid for this?" he asked softly. "But I can't let you do that." "You don't have a choice," she said with a warm smile, crossing her arms. "You've had a hard enough night. Consider it a thank you for being one of the good guys." He shook his head slowly, looking down at the receipt again. That is incredibly kind of you. People don't usually do that." "Well, People don't usually have to deal with a mob while they're trying to eat a cheeseburger, she replied. You deserve a break. Keanu took a deep breath. He looked at the waitress, really looking at her, as if trying to memorize her face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He unfolded a crisp $100 bill. He knew she had already paid for the food, but he wasn't going to leave without showing his gratitude. He placed the $100 bill under the empty coffee cup, pressing it down firmly so it wouldn't blow away. Please, he said, tapping the cup. Take this. For you. Not for the restaurant. Sir, I can't take $100, she protested, her eyes widening. That's way too much. You earned it, he said firmly. His voice was gentle, but there was a strength behind it that told her he wouldn't take no for an answer. You stepped in when no one else did. You made me feel human again tonight. That is worth more than $100 to me. He slid out of the booth and stood up. He was taller than she expected, and despite the beard and the casual clothes, he had a powerful presence. But it wasn't an intimidating presence, it was a calm one. Thank you, he said, extending his hand. She shook his hand. It was a warm, solid handshake. No fancy tricks, just a genuine grip. You're very welcome, Keanu, she said softly. Take care of yourself, he replied. You too. He pulled his baseball cap down low again, shielding his eyes. He shoved his hands into his pockets and turned toward the door. This time, he didn't have to sneak. He didn't have to hide. He walked through the diner with his head up, walking with a relaxed stride that wasn't there when he arrived. The bell above the door jingled as he pushed it open. A cold gust of rainy air blew into the diner, but it didn't feel bad this time. It felt refreshing. He stepped out into the wet night, disappearing into the darkness of the street. The waitress stood there for a moment, looking at the empty booth. The plate was gone, the cup was empty. The only thing left was the $100 bill under the cup and the memory of the interaction. She walked over to the table and picked up the money. She looked around the diner. The other customers were back to their own lives, eating their food, scrolling through their phones. They had no idea that a movie star had just been sitting there, or that a small act of kindness had just made his night. It was her secret now, too. She folded the $100 and put it in her apron pocket right next to her heart. It wasn't about the money, although that would certainly help with the rent. It was about the connection. It was about knowing that even someone who has everything can still appreciate a little bit of decency. She smiled, wiped down the table one last time, and turned back to the kitchen, ready to finish her shift with a little more energy in her step.